Why am I here? Well, I was invited. So, the general and I are related, so I'm actually a second cousin of General Joseph Hooker, fifth removed. So we would be second cousins 5 generations back. So I want to say that I'm no expert. I have I'm driven to learn about history and to find out about all of these interesting things. I wouldn't call myself an expert in any way. A lot of you guys and gals know a lot more about history than I do, so please feel free to call me out if you notice anything. Drop me a line or shoot me an email if I've misspoken or if I've misstated the facts in any way. I'm very interested in history. I have been since I was a very young child. And I have that interesting connection, I think, with General Hooker. So I'm here to learn from you guys as much as you learn from me, hopefully. And so that's kind of how I want to keep it. So I'll give you my contact info at the end, and if you wish to reach out to me, please feel free. As Bob said, he and I swap stories about the Civil War over pints sometimes and things like that. So it's very, we enjoy that. So I'm going to start with Lincoln's letter to Hooker, and Lincoln placed the general in the charge of the Army of the Potomac in 1863. And at the time, the morale to the troops was quite low. There was sentiment towards the war was starting to wane on the Union side. They were expecting a quick victory. They were expecting it to end quickly, and it had raged on far longer than anyone expected. Fredericksburg had just happened and was a total disaster. The Union was defeated pretty soundly by Lee and his men, and the morale in the Army of the Potomac especially, and the order of the army was pretty low at the time. So it was kind of a gamble for Lincoln to put Hooker in charge. Then again, it wasn't, because Lincoln knew it was the thing he had to do. There was public sentiment was growing towards Hooker. He was prominent in the newspapers at the time, and he had gotten a reputation among his men as, the person who could possibly lead to victory. So the letter is dated January 26, 1863, from the Executive Mansion, and it goes as follows. Major General Hooker, General, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done so. I have done this. Funny technology, huh? I have done this upon what appears to me to be sufficient reasons. And yet I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not an indispensable, quality. You are ambitious within reasonable bounds, which does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the Army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you do a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was recently saying, it was not for this, but in spite of this, that I have given you the command. Only those generals that gain successes can set up dictators. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done or will do for any of its commanders. I much fear that this spirit, which you have aided to infuse into the Army, of criticizing their commander and of withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it. And now, beware of rashness. Beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance, go forward and give us victories. Yours very truly, Abraham Lincoln. some letter writer.
Was good.
Interestingly, he gives him the command almost begrudgingly, but he knows it's the right thing to do. So the general in me, growing up hooker, well, at a certain point in my life, it was quite a lot of fun to be a hooker. There was a time where it wasn't as much fun. So third, fourth grade, people start to discover, girls and prostitution, and they see things on television, and all of a sudden you're a hooker, and it's not as much fun. So around fifth grade or so, in history class, I hear about a famous hooker. At that time, it was Sir Thomas Hooker, who founded the colony of Hartford, which would go on to be the state of Connecticut in the 1600s. But I go home and I said, Mom, are we related to this famous hooker? And she says, you know what? We do have famous hooker relatives. I think he was in the Civil War. Why don't you check with your grandmother? Now, my Grandma Hooker was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in St. Remy, New York, which is upstate rural New York. And she taught generations of people in that small one-room schoolhouse. She did some research and came to find out that we were indeed related to General Joseph Hooker. So I always knew that, but I didn't do anything with it. I kind of kept it in my back pocket until, later on, this would be useful at some point to kind of give these kids a little bit of what it really means to be a hooker. So, and I enjoy it to this day. We have a lot of fun with it. In my adult research, I discovered not only am I second cousins of the general, but my second great-grandfather, so my great-great-grandfather, was also served in the Civil War, Edson Hooker. He enlisted in Company F, New York 1st Cavalry Regiment in 1863. Interestingly, he was 32 years old, and for me, I think, wow, you're 32 years old, you have kids, you have a family, you have why, risk it all? But that was what everybody did, right? It was all hands on deck, essentially, at that point. He enlisted as a private and mustered out as a full corporal, so he had some successes. I don't know if it happened to do with the fact that he was second cousins of the general, but couldn't hurt, I guess. I don't have any information there, but I hope to find out more about him. So, Hooker's youth. Eventually later General Hooker, was born in Hadley, Massachusetts in 1814. He had two sisters. His grandfather was Captain Joseph Hooker, was a captain in the Revolutionary War. He was the grandfather of Joseph Hooker. Now that Captain Hooker had a younger brother, John. John is my fifth great-grandfather. So we're also related to this captain of the Revolutionary War, which I found really interesting. They grew up not particularly wealthy. However, Hooker had a drive to serve, and he was sent to the U.S. Military Academy primarily because, and this is the wife speaking, it was free. So he graduates in 1837. One of his graduating class was later General Sedgwick, who fights under him at Chancellorsville. They have their run-ins later on, which is interesting. But essentially, that time frame, you could see a lot of the eventual players in the Civil War who were U.S. Military Academy graduates from West Point. So his pre-Civil War military career, in 1837, right out of school, he's basically given a commission as a second lieutenant, and he serves in the Seminole Wars in Florida. He's promoted to first lieutenant. He's stationed in Vermont and Maine. 1846, the Mexican-American War breaks out, and the Mexican-American War is very prominent in lots of the futures of the eventual commanders and the big stories of the Civil War, because that's where a lot of the eventual generals and higher ranks made their bones, so to speak. And Hooker was no exception to that. Mexican women in the towns got to calling him El Capitan Hermoso, which is the handsome captain due to his good looks. Had something of a way with women, they say. That's a pretty interesting aside. So in 1849, he's promoted 3 times during the Mexican-American War. It's a pretty quick ascent. He is sent to the headquarters of the West Coast Command in Sonoma in 1849. He serves as Adjutant General of the Pacific Division of the U.S. Army from 1848 to 1853. That's in Sonoma. He actually spends more time in Sonoma, California than he does anywhere else in his life, almost 10 years. And he lived to be 64. So California took to him as kind of their adopted son, and they would often write letters to him on the battlefield and, you know, celebrate his victories and things like that. He was part of them, so to speak. So in Sonoma, he is called to testify in a court-martial of Gideon Pillow. Now, Pillow was a colleague of his during the Mexican-American War, and the commander, Winfield Scott, called a court-martial to Pillow. It was quite a suspicious court-martial because Pillow had some evidence that Scott had been taking bribes, and that came to light during the trial. Hooker testified on Pillow's behalf, and Scott never forgave him for this. Pillow was exonerated. So he resigns from the Army in 1853, probably due to some political pressure. One thing I found really interesting in doing all this research is we have this idea of the good old days that people got together on things. Let me tell you, the politics back then were probably nastier than they are today. So if you think it's bad today, it's probably been worse. So that was an interesting piece that I found in my research. So Hooker's in Sonoma through the gold rush of 1849. It's said that when he leaves the academy in 1837, he was not known as an imbiber of alcohol. However, by the time he leaves California, he's quite the opposite and a regular imbiber of the drink, and whiskey in particular. He's also fond of gambling. The Blue Wing Saloon is a hotel, which is, I'm calling it a casino. Today you would call it a casino because they had card games everywhere and people were gambling and drinking and doing all kinds of things in 1849 and in California. Some other prominent patrons of the bar were William T. Sherman, Kit Carson. Kit Carson's brother actually runs against Hooker in an election for assemblyman, and Hooker's defeated by 13 votes. So U.S. Grant, also Ulysses S. Grant, frequents the place. He also hangs around at a place called the El Dorado Hotel, which is still in Sonoma. If you wanted to go visit, they supposedly have really good food. So in 1850, he purchases 550 acres of land in the city, near the city of Sonoma. He builds a house there. That house is still in the plaza in Sonoma, California, and they do give tours, but they're closed on Tuesday, which I found out. Depressing. So don't go on Tuesday. So he wants to be a farmer, essentially. He says, I'll try my hand at farming. I have all this land. And he does pretty well with it. He's the area's largest producer of barley. He also plants grapes. He clears the forest and sells lumber to the army and makes a huge profit. So he's doing pretty well, but it is said of this time that Hooker likes gambling and whiskey a whole lot more than agriculture. So he quickly gets bored of this. He runs for state assemblyman. He then runs for overseer of Sonoma County roads. He's elected, so he's making money doing that. But again, he's kind of bored. He sells all of his assets in California. Possibly settles up his gambling debts. Possibly not. It's fuzzy on that. He goes to Oregon to become supervisor of military roads. for a bit, and then he comes back to California. So 1861, the Civil War breaks out. And he, at this time, discovers he has no cash flow due to gambling debts, and he's basically spent all his money on having a good time in California. So what he does is he gets together a regiment of Union volunteers, and he starts drilling them. So his interest is, I'm gonna whip these men into shape, and we're gonna fight in whatever way we can. He then discovers that no California regiments will be enlisted into the Eastern fight. So he, knowing that he needs to be where the action is, he is depressed. He goes into a bar in San Francisco, and he's drinking his sorrows away, and the proprietor comes up and says, "Hooker, why the long face?" And he says, "Well, I need to get east because I'm a soldier. I want to raise my sword for the Union Army. I'm a trained soldier at West Point. This is where my life is, and I can't get there." And he says, "Well, do you need money?" And he says, "Yes, I need about $700. So Billy Chapman, who is the proprietor of the place, goes back to his room and comes out with a lot of bills, and he hands him $1,000, and he says, "I'm going to put you on a boat. I will see you off at the dock. I will make sure that there's plenty of cigars and whiskey in your cabin for the trip. Please do us proud. I cannot serve, so you're going to do it for all of California." It's not a loan. He doesn't ask for it back. So Hooker goes to New York. And in June of 1861, Hooker arrives in New York. He makes contact with some influential politicians who write letters on his behalf. He's looking for a commission. He's asking anyone who will listen, and he's basically trying to talk a big game that he can lead and he can fight. There are, as you can imagine, lots of others who are interested in the same thing, so they're giving out commissions kind of left and right. All of his letters go unanswered, and he can't understand why. He soon discovers that General Winfield Scott is the commander of the Federal armies and is basically throwing his letters into the 1861 version of the circular file. So he decides he's going to have to make his case directly in DC. So he travels to DC, and in July of 1861, the first Bull Run happens, and he rides off with a contingent of his contemporaries, probably other people who are looking for commissions, or just people who are interested in viewing the battle. So Hooker, with the soldier's eye, views the battle from somewhat afar, discovers that the strategy is all wrong, and he could have done it better, which is common for Hooker to think. So he goes to the White House. He requests and receives a personal audience with Lincoln. And so he's introduced to Abraham Lincoln with as Captain Hooker. And Lincoln says, "Nice to meet you." Doesn't really think much of him. He looks at him, doesn't think that much. Hooker says, "I know I was introduced to you as Captain Hooker. I'm actually Lieutenant Colonel in the regular army." And Lincoln says, "Is that so? Well, Captain, tell me what you think." And so they start having a conversation. Lincoln is about to walk away, and "Thank you very much." And so Hooker says to him, "I was at the Battle of Bull Run the other day, and it is neither vanity or boasting in me to declare that I am a damn sight better general than you, sir, had on that field." So Lincoln's impressed. He was impressed enough to give him a command. He says, "Okay, let's sit down and talk." So they discuss things. And later Lincoln would say of the relationship, "He had an air of a man of sense and intelligence who thoroughly believed in himself and who would at least try to make his words good." So his boasting actually impresses Lincoln, and he and Lincoln would have a close relationship throughout the rest of Lincoln's life. In July of 1861, Lincoln sends 11 names to the Senate as nominees for commission of Brigadier General. Hooker is one. Ulysses S. Grant is one of the others. Hooker is actually placed 15th in rank, which is 2 positions above Grant, for what it's worth, very early, as we know, and we know how that all worked out in the end. However, pretty interesting piece that I found. So he's placed in the command of a division of the Union Army of Virginia. He has roles in the Peninsula Campaign and the Second Battle of Bull Run. So
The flag.
it's interesting.
He thinks you're doing
Well, it's,
good.
It's better than my practice runs, which included my dog barking at me constantly. So he leads some men in the Battle of Bull Run, does very well. What he does as a commander is he's something of a taskmaster. He believes in drills, discipline, presentation, and order. He makes himself accessible to officers and soldiers to air complaints or ask favors of him. He takes efforts to ensure that the troops receive their rations, their clothing, and supplies, which not a lot of commanders had done to that point. And Hooker basically tries to get his men to fight for him by doing everything that he can to make sure that their lives are as comfortable as possible. They get their whiskey, they get their meals, gambling and prostitution look the other way, that kind of thing. So he balanced discipline with kind of a paternalism to gain the favor of his men. He believed in a well-organized army, and he did everything he could to make sure that that happened. So in Williamsburg, he is sent to lead a division, and McClellan at that time is heading the Army of the Potomac. So at Williamsburg, a dispatch is sent to the northern newspapers, and the headline had intended to say, "Fighting Joe Hooker." Somehow in the typesetting, they fumbled the dash, and so the headline just read, "Fighting Joe Hooker." The name stuck, and he was called Fighting Joe Hooker ever since. He never liked the name. He always said of the name, "People will think I'm a highwayman or a bandit." Not happy with the name, but it stuck. In fact, in later memos and transmissions, General Lee would poke fun at him by calling him the F.J. Hooker, probably knowing he didn't like it. So in Antietam, he serves with distinction. His men actually fired the first shots of the battle. He's wounded while leading a charge of men towards the front line. He's shot in the foot, and the bullet goes right through his foot. A surgeon on hand says, inspects it, and he's bleeding, he's losing blood. As they're taking away in the stretcher, he's giving commands for his men, fight forward, and they're basically pulling him off the battlefield. So McClellan is removed during the fight, because the Union ekes out a small victory, but afterwards McClellan is removed for not pursuing Lee to Richmond. So Ambrose Burnside is given command of the Army of the Potomac, and Hooker, while recuperating at the insane asylum in D.C., is dispatching letters to his family, which get published in the newspaper, and writing directly to editors of newspapers, and basically boasting that if he had not been wounded, he would have defeated the rebel army himself. McClellan actually agrees with this in his report. So Hooker's getting a lot of fame and notoriety, and the public is starting to get a feel for who he is. 12,000 casualties for the Union side, 10,000 for the Confederate in Antietam. Also included, which you guys probably all know, the bloodiest day of the Civil War, Antietam. Bloodiest day in American history, I believe. So December of 1862 to 63 is Fredericksburg. And Burnside is the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker leads a division, corps. And so the things that doom Burnside are, for one, they were supposed to get some pontoon bridges to cross the Rappahannock River. He gets them very late, so late to the point that they're basically installing them while the rebel army is watching them do so they can't install bridges and then cross the bridge. It's just bad news. So the plans are just a mess. Burnside, knowing the history of past commanders of the Army of the Potomac, feels if he doesn't succeed, or at least try to succeed, he's going to be ushered off to someplace outside of where the action is. So he feels as if he must make an attack he must make some last-ditch attempt. So by the end of his campaign, his troops marched through heavy rainstorms in the mud. It's called the Mud March in Fredericksburg. He basically sends 13,000 men to their death. It's quite an example of Burnside trying to do everything he could when all hope was probably lost, and he probably would have been better off to not pursue. But he did, and desertion at this point is rampant, morale is at a low point, disorder is high. Hooker starts talking out against Burnside, and he says nothing would go right until we had a dictator, and the sooner the better. This is what Lincoln refers to in his letter. Hooker basically thinks he could do it better, and he says as much. So the troops in the top popular opinion are starting to swell toward Hooker. Lincoln has almost no choice but to put Hooker in charge. So May 1863, he's placed in command by then. Chancellorsville is the next battle. The town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, is 15 miles from Richmond, the Confederate capital. So they're pretty close. Hooker, even though Fredericksburg was a disaster, he feels like he has the men. He has 130 men under him, and Lee has only 65,000. Hooker believes that he can win this thing and win the war, essentially, and a lot of people agree. So Lincoln visits the camp. At this point, Fighting Joe had taken his administrative tasks to a new level and really laid down everything that he believed in: order, discipline, presentation of the troops, getting them their furloughs when needed, so he had a well-rested, well-trained army ready to attack. He also discovered at this time that they were waiting for a judgment on whether they could shoot deserters, and the word came back that they were allowed to do so. So there was a lot of things in his favor. The troops were in good spirits. Again, he had a huge force. So Chancellorsville, Hooker is, as some have said, 24 hours from winning the Civil War. Lee has his men on the north side of the Rappahannock River, and Hooker is just south of that. The pontoon bridges are in place now. He knows that if he sends his men up and around to the north and from the south, he can basically squeeze Lee and push him back to Richmond. So Hooker talks of his plan. He tells everyone how great his plan is and how it's going to succeed. And people probably believe this, and Hooker believed it himself. He had a huge advantage in force, 2-1, and Lee had not as many men, poor equipment, not the best rations. Everything that the rebel forces had was basically the strength of their men, the will of their men. So the battle goes badly. One thing, some things that happened here was, so Hooker splits his forces in 3 places, really. He takes the cavalry and he sends them to cut the communications out of Fredericksburg. So the rail lines, the telegraph lines, all the communication is cut. That's entirely basically what the cavalry does. They see no other fighting than that. The other thing is that his men take on fire much sooner than they expected, so Lee's men are on the attack. I think now, when I look back, both were trained similarly by the same people at the U.S. Military Academy. Lee has really no choice but to fight because he's so close to Richmond. If he gives up, the war's over and he knows it. He's going to be pushed back to Richmond. He's defeated. So he has no choice but to fight. He does some brilliant things by splitting his army in a defensive position. Splitting your army in half is unknown at the time. He also creates a diversionary tactic which leaves some of Hooker's men cooking dinner when they're come upon by rebel forces, and they basically turn and flee and are captured. So Hooker's waiting for one of his corps to succeed in a minor battle before he proceeds, and that never happens. No one ever wins a minor battle, let alone a major one. There's also something near Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, called the Wilderness, and Hooker's headquarters is in the wilderness in a clearing at the Chancellor's house. That's what Chancellorsville. John Chancellor owns this house where they set up headquarters. It was an inn prior to that. So the Wilderness is a 100-square-acre forest. There was large tree growth that was all cut down to feed iron ore, smelting iron ore for the war effort, but probably for other things prior to that. So they had a lot of low growth. This wilderness of 100 square miles was essentially all low growth, very thick foliage that you couldn't really get through. So on a foggy day or a rainy day, as Burnside saw in the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's almost impossible to fight or see who you're fighting. So Lee uses that to its advantage. As I said, these are two commanders trained by the same people, essentially. I kind of think Lee knows what Hooker's going to do. So there's a wilderness, they're splitting the forces. Hooker decides, we're going to retreat. I've seen no battle wins for any of my men. We're going to retreat and entrench and wait for reinforcements. He still has a huge advantage. All of his commanders are blown away that he's actually doing this. In fact, Henry Slocum, who's commanding one of his corps, one of his divisions, is approached by Washington Roebling, who is the messenger, and Washington Roebling will later go on to build the Brooklyn Bridge in 1880s in New York. So Washington Roebling hands him the orders from Hooker that says retreat. Slocum says, "It's a damn lie. I will go to Hooker myself, and if I find you to be lying, I'll shoot you on the spot." Good thing he didn't, because I kind of like the Brooklyn Bridge. So he goes back to Hooker, finds indeed the sad news. He's to retreat. All of his commanders to ahead are disappointed. They still had a huge advantage. They still feel like they can win this, but Hooker loses his nerve. So he would later go on to say, it's debatable whether he actually said this or not, but clearly he did lose his confidence. But he famously said to Abner Doubleday, Doubleday said, actually, I'll hold that to the end because I have some other pieces to put in there. But he basically admits that he lost confidence in himself. So the cavalry had cut all the lines out of Fredericksburg. So it's not going well. His men are retreated and entrenched, waiting for reinforcements that probably will never come. So Hooker's standing on the veranda of Chancellorsville's front, the inn, and he's receiving orders from one of his messengers, and he leans over the railing, and just at that time, a hill that's just in view, that they vacated recently, thinking it wasn't strategic. Well, the artillery had set up from the rebel side and were able to see the Chancellorsville headquarters, and they lob a shell towards Chancellorsville. The shell is a 15-pound shell. It hits the veranda and knocks a pillar down, which knocks General Hooker out cold. The shell does not explode. However, it does enough damage that the inn is in shambles. Hooker is knocked out. He is given some whiskey to rouse him, and he's propped up upon his horse to show everybody that he's fine, but he's not fine. He's at least concussed, probably doesn't know where he is, but his mentality says we're going to continue the fight, because that's what he does. So he spends most of the day essentially incapacitated. They extract him to a nearby house, and the Chancellorsville headquarters is essentially in ruins at that point. So they prop him up in the house, and they have a meeting of generals, war, to talk about where they're going to go. And Hooker gives his only subordinate his closest subordinate, Darius Couch, responsibility. He gives him responsibility, but he doesn't give him full command. So Hooker is still commanding from this incapacitated state. He says, hold the line. We've got Lee, we're just where we want him. There's still hope here. And Couch thinks he's crazy. But he follows the orders as told. So Hooker retreats, entrenches, Lee overruns him, Chancellorsville is in ruins, the army is defeated, Lee rides into Chancellorsville viewing the carnage, and basically they said at that point that he had ascended to godlike stature. So this is his best battle of the war. However, is it a total loss? Well, there's a couple of things that happened in Chancellorsville. One was Stonewall Jackson leading a charge on the southern end, rides up to a hill and discovers that Stonewall Jackson was Lee's greatest asset in the war and had fought admirably, and Lee probably didn't know what he would do without him if he were to lose him. So Stonewall Jackson rides up to near the wilderness, foggy, cloudy area, and he takes on fire. He discovers that his own men are shooting at him. So one of his commanders yells, "You're shooting at your own men." And the other men on the other side say, "It's a damn Yankee trick, fire again." So they lay into him. He's shot 3 times. His arm is amputated. He's evacuated from the scene. Jeb Stuart is placed in the command. Jeb Stuart was a cavalry officer and knew little about infantry. So it didn't help Hooker's cause overall at Chancellorsville. However, Stonewall Jackson suffered a mortal wound. They pulled him out to Fredericksburg, and needing surgery, they discovered that the rail lines had been cut, and they could not get to Richmond. Stonewall Jackson dies. So Chancellorsville responsible for the mortal wound of Jackson. The other piece to Chancellorsville that I think you have to look at is, yes, Lee's successful. Yes, the rebel wins the fight. However, they lose 14,000 of their men out of 60. So that's 24% of their fighting force, whereas the Union only lost 12%. So can the South afford to lose 24% in each small victory? Going forward, it's pretty significant. And when you consider that they're no further ahead or behind than when the battle began. So they still have Lee in a tough place. Lee suffers, yes, has a victory. He is confident, perhaps he's overconfident. So Hooker pursues Lee. He's essentially a beaten man, but he knows only one thing to do, which is fight. So he pursues Lee north, and Lee takes an interesting route. Everyone seems to think that the battle is going to take place in Pennsylvania. So he looks suspiciously like he's about to invade the North. Hooker's pursuing him. Hooker asks Lincoln, submit some plans to attack Richmond. Hooker says, do not attack Richmond, pursue the army. So Hooker finds himself blocked, defeated at Chancellorsville, decides that going forward, he's going to have a tough time in enacting his plans, and he's going to be marching to someone else's plans. So he resigns. General Meade is installed as the head of the Army of the Potomac. This is 3 days prior to Gettysburg, the actual Battle of Gettysburg. Hooker is already in Gettysburg, aligning his troops and things like that. Hooker resigns 3 days before, and Meade goes on to eke out a victory in Antietam. I say that the battles are so close, and I think it's because of this dynamic of them all kind of understanding the same military theory that they had been taught. So these battles are all very close. It was a matter of the Union outlasting them, essentially, and the poor rations and having control of the railroads that the South certainly didn't have, having no support from a third-party country, things like that. Emancipation Proclamation, which Hooker was in favor of and says so. Those types of things are probably the greater, but these battles are very tight. And so, so that the victory is won for the Union, and I say that because Lincoln delivers the Union address, the Gettysburg Address. I don't recall Jefferson Davis giving any addresses that day. Maybe he has, I don't know. So anyway, that's Gettysburg. So July 1863 is Gettysburg, 32,000 total casualties. Horrible tragedy on both sides, but it serves to turn the war in favor of the Federal Army. So Hooker then goes on to serve. He's placed in Chattanooga. He wins a battle called Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. He's sent to the Western Theater. On the way to Gettysburg, and I meant to hit this, and I'll double back. So on the way to Gettysburg, this is the rumored whether it happened or didn't happen with Doubleday. Hooker and Doubleday are riding along, and another thing, interestingly, was Hooker, being an imbiber of the drink, decided this is my biggest opportunity yet. I'm not going to drink at Chancellorsville. So he abstains from drinking alcohol against all of his contemporaries' ideas of what he should do. Some said he should continue his usual habits, right? But he wanted his mind to be clear. So he didn't drink. And he was given whiskey as a prescription when he was wounded, and some say that he religiously took his prescription as prescribed, and so he took the whiskey, but only medicinally. He did not drink, was not drunk on the battlefield, as we can find. So Abner Doubleday says to him, "What happened at Chancellorsville? Were you drunk? Were you hit by the shell? Tell me what happened." So Hooker says, "I was not drunk, and it was not the shell. It was this one time that I lost confidence in Joe Hooker, and that's the end of it." So he fights in Chattanooga. He also fights in Atlanta and leads a group of men in Atlanta. And in Hooker fashion, true Hooker fashion, he resigns 3 days before the Battle of Atlanta and the burning of Atlanta and the success that they had there. So the glory goes to another general because Hooker decides he's not getting his men, he's not getting his way, and he resigns. So he's sent to an administrative duties in Ohio, and there he meets Olivia Grossman, who is the sister of a congressman and a member of a prominent family in Ohio. He marries her in 1865. She dies in 1868. He retires. He retires in 1868. He actually has a number of strokes, and a doctor, a surgeon, and he had a lot of friends who were doctors, testified after the war at the Committee on the Conduct of the War that these strokes were probably a result of the shell and the pillar hitting him in the head. In 1874, interestingly, he goes back and visits Chancellorsville. So we have evidence that he went back to the site, and I find that interesting and kind of, full circle. He dies in 1879. So, legacy. So there's an equestrian statue at the Massachusetts State House. It's Hooker on a horse. It's an equestrian statue. It's dedicated in 1903. Interestingly, Daniel Chester French is the artist. He's also commissioned to do the Lincoln Memorial. So he leaves a legacy in Sonoma County. Not only the house that still stands there, but he planted grapes that are still giving fruit to this day. And if you ever see a wine called Bedrock out of California, those are made from Hooker's vines, who are producing fruit, as I said.
They're good too. I'll vouch for them.
Really tasty, really
Yeah,
good
they're
wine.
really-
It is Bedrock.
Yeah, Bedrock.
Bedrock, huh?
Yep.
Okay.
You can get it at AJ's.
Yep.
AJ's. So Sonoma County has left a legacy there. There's a Hooker County in Nebraska. I couldn't find any record of Hooker being in Nebraska, but they liked him so much they named the county. And he leaves a legacy with hookers like us. And again, there's something I call the Hooker legend. So very popular in his time. There were songs about him. Hooker takes his whiskey strong. They sung songs about him. He was a very popular figure back in the times. And kind of to this day, there's been a lot written about him, which made me doing my research very easy. And so, the prostitution link. As I said, Hooker was very careful to say he didn't like being called Fighting Joe Hooker. He was very savvy with the press. So my belief is, and there was a lot of evidence to that, they were calling Hooker's girls, Hooker's divisions, and things like this. Clearly led a blind eye to what his men were doing in the camps with regard to that, and didn't care as long as they fought on the battlefield for him. The slang word for hooker as a prostitute actually has evidence prior to him reaching the public eye. So I say that it was neither because of him that it was invented, but he certainly did nothing to curb its popularity, and probably got a kick out of it, in my estimation. So my speech is called Truths, Half-Truths, and Myths. So I'll lay some out. I've already gone through a lot of them. So one truth is he served as Marshal-in-Chief of Lincoln's funeral procession. So he actually led on horseback in Springfield, May 4th, 1865, led Lincoln to his final resting place. So Lincoln thought enough of him, and people knew that enough to place him in that position. Interestingly, too, his legacy ends with this one. During the course of the procession, Hooker spies a pickpocket in the crowd. He apprehends him and, quote, gave the thief a kick that sent him no less than 10 to 15 feet. So, truth, Stonewall Jackson, not directly defeated by his fire, but on his watch for sure. Another interesting thing was Hooker liked to stay at the insane asylum. As far as I know, he was never deemed to be insane. However, whenever he was in Washington, D.C., they had a room for him at the insane asylum. He stayed there 5 or 6 times. I just found that interesting. I don't know if that was common during the day back in that time. So half-truth, Hooker is a term for prostitutes. I'm calling that a half-truth because it's kind of true and it's kind of not. He certainly, let's say, popularized the term. His alcohol and consumption and gambling, there's lots of evidence to both sides. Certainly he did a lot of gambling in 1849 in California. Possibly others did as well. Sherman was known to run up some card debts in his own headquarters. So I think he definitely dabbled, but later on in his 60s in Ohio, I don't see him as much of a gambler. Their alcohol consumption the same way. There are some that said he wasn't a huge drinker. Some said he was a hard drinking ladies' man. The myths, he liked to be called Fighting Joe. He didn't. And then that Chancellorsville was a total loss. There's a lot to be gained there and a lot to be said for what Hooker did in setting up Gettysburg and the victory there by Meade. So thanks and credits. For one, I'd like to thank my dad. So I never served in the military, though I respect everyone who did and do. But my dad was a proud veteran of the Korean War, recently passed away, but without him I wouldn't be Hooker, so I'd like to thank him. Stephen Sears wrote Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Walter Hebert wrote Fighting Joe Hooker. Ancestry.com for the genealogy, the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, SonomaLeague.org, Bruce Catton, who wrote Glory Road, and Dr. Bob McCord, who invited me here today. So.
Very good. Very good.
I'll take questions.